Before we get there, though, just to talk a little bit more about the dynamics of manufacturing and some of the different regions that you might want to look to if you're thinking about diversification, which I think a lot of US companies are, because they are seeing some of this tit for tat trade war, technological wars, geopolitical wars, et cetera, coming up between the US and China. That could be a whole podcast in and of itself. But what is it about the Chinese manufacturing hub that makes it so competitive? I'm particularly curious. Like, I'm assuming wages have increased over the last 30 years in China as they've kind of commercialized and, leveled up. But is it just their skill set is just much better in terms of manufacturing and being nimble? Is the technology better? Walk us through that a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think it really stems from both, the actual average wage in China and then also the source of materials, right? Like a lot of people don't realize when you produce any consumer product, you've got to look at where the raw materials are stemming from. And the vast majority of products have raw materials that can stem from China. And so it's kind of like the mecca of raw materials for any product you could think of, whether it be watches or, furniture or, you name it. I mean, really any consumer product, there's raw materials that a factory could utilize in China. Whereas if you go to Mexico, even Mexico, a lot of suppliers are getting the raw materials from China or from other places in the world. And so they just don't have the access to raw materials. I think that's first and foremost. And then secondly, kind of like what you hinted at in terms of the cost of labor there, which is, very affordable from a manufacturing standpoint. And also the diligence, I think, of the way that factories are run and managed. I mean, a lot of times, I've been to factories in China that are actually better managed than factories in America, and vice versa, right? I don't think there's like a one size fits all type of outlook that people should have. I mean, definitely there's some factories in China that are really poorly run and have horrible quality, but the same could be said as some factories in America too, right? So I think at the end of the day, it really depends on the supplier you're working with and how you can diligent them to produce, the product that you want to produce. But yeah, I mean, from a geopolitical standpoint, it definitely stems from raw materials and cost of labor.
So basically, they've got a lot of raw materials. So if you're producing or if you're trying to produce in other areas, they're usually going to get those raw materials from China. There's efficiently run factories with cheap cost of labor. And, ostensibly from what I've heard, they have great technological advancements in those factories. I mean, especially if you look at sneakers, which, I have some experience in, you look at Italian factories, they can't even compete with some of the tooling that the Chinese factories have, which is really interesting when you think about
Right.
luxury sneakers and how they're, for years have been made in Italy.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of sneakers, the biggest factory I've been to was actually in Vietnam, and they produced for like Clark's and Adidas and a lot of just like the major shoe brands. And they literally had like 20,000 people in their factory. It was like a mini like town that they had, and they had like a whole. I mean, it was literally a town that was a factory. It was just you had to see it for your own eyes. It was crazy.
So for some of the large American manufacturers who are thinking about diversification, we've seen Apple look at Indian factories, and I'm assuming a lot of that economic spillover will enrich some of these other, Southeast Asian locales like Vietnam or Cambodia or others. What do you think the lag time is there just with those countries being able to compete with like a China? And I mean, more specifically, I'm interested in, e-commerce founders or consumer direct to consumer founders, retail consumer founders in the US trying to think about like how resilient is my supply chain and where should I be thinking about diversification?
Yeah, I mean, like Apple, look, Apple doesn't produce the products themselves, right? They contract with Foxconn, and so it's more of a question of Foxconn and how agile can they be in terms of producing products for Apple. I think there's, large incentives for China, obviously, to keep Apple producing products in China, and I think they, will keep some of their supply chain there. But, Foxconn at their level definitely is thinking about and wants to diversify. But, for them, I mean, a few cents just means so much in terms of the cost of an item because the volume that they're producing at, right? And so I think with Foxconn, they have facilities across Asia already. It's just a matter of are there the raw material sources there? Do we have the right labor there? And what are kind of the geopolitical climates in those countries that we're potentially moving Apple's supply chain to? I think most, medium-sized brands like sub 100 mil don't necessarily need to really think too closely about that. I mean, unless you've just got an incredible supplier outside of China. Most of the time, you're going to be in China. But there are some amazing suppliers outside of China too, right? And diversification is definitely important. But I'm going to say, it's a lot harder to diversify remotely, and I think a lot of companies, really need to work with like a Sourcify or have their own sourcing team in Vietnam or Pakistan or India or wherever it may be, because I think the quality issues that come up outside of China can be a lot more drastic than within, and that's partially because Chinese factories have just been so used to dealing with American brands for so long, so they understand kind of the quality that we expect and the relationship that we expect. Whereas if you're going to a supplier in India that hasn't exported to America or exports a small amount to America, what you realize is that the quality standards in Europe and in Africa and in North America are vastly different. So you've got to really understand, well, where has this country mostly been exporting to, and obviously where has this factory mostly been exporting to.